Greetings. This is Guy64, and I have been in a hiatus on YouTube in the past 2 months or so, which explains why I haven't made any new videos in a long while. And I apologize for keeping you guys waiting. And it's mainly because I've been very busy with my full-time job and working on my personal projects, most notably Project Scarlet, which is still in the making and still a bit far from its prime time. But hopefully I should be able to make a sort of a montage video of it by January of next year, hopefully. So yeah, I did a bit of an overhaul on it, and yeah, and it's also mainly because I haven't really had much in the way of material and ideas that would warrant a video that will be interesting for me to work on, and maybe as well as being interesting for you guys to watch. Well, I thought I'd just diversify for now, since I've been meaning to do a video of this thing for a while, and it's not a particularly vintage thing, which is the stuff that I usually do videos of, but I thought of doing a video of this anyway as a bit of a diversion for now. So I'm gonna do a video of this Dell Latitude E6410 laptop. It's a business-end laptop that will have cost a lot of money from when this was new back in 2009 or 2010. So this is a 7-year-old laptop. It's probably turning 18 by next year. So yeah, I thought of making a video of this, more specifically to those who are looking into a decent laptop that has some pretty decent upgrade options that are cheap from the used market. And I thought I'd share my thoughts and experiences with this laptop, especially since I've been using this laptop since February of this year, which is slowly coming into an end now. And I thought of sharing it in case it would be useful to those looking for a pretty decent, old but pretty decent laptop for cheap. So I'm going to explain the kind of upgrade options you can have on this laptop, the specs of my particular E6410, what it's like to use in 2017 pretty much, and see if it's still held up pretty well, considering that this was once fairly top of the line laptop back in 2009. So yeah. Also, this video is probably going to be the worst quality video I've made so far, mainly because I accidentally shot most of the clips for this video in 1080i 50 FPS, which means that when I edit it on Kdenlive, Kdenlive doesn't know how to deinterlace 50i to 50p, so most of the clips end up being 25 FPS, and the only clips that are 60 FPS are these intermission clips of me, and also some old clips that I took back in April, because I was actually thought of making a video of this laptop since March or April, I guess, but it didn't really had much confidence to continue working on it. So yeah, how unfortunate. So the only options I have to correct that would either be just cancel the video project or reshoot everything, which would take forever, which I cannot do, especially since my my time is pretty limited, especially when I have a full-time job. So yeah, it sucks. So next time when I deal with my Lumix camera, Panasonic Lumix, I must make sure that the video is in AVC HD PSH, otherwise the whole clips are ruined pretty much. I prefer to keep my videos 50 FPS, but I wish it would be 60, but unfortunately my camera only records at PAL frame rates for some weird reason. So anyway, with that aside, let's get into this laptop, shall we, and see if it's still held up after all these years since this thing was new. Well, here's my Dell Latitude E6410, which I got for $70 US used off eBay US, shipped over to the Philippines thanks to a proxy service.
I actually have two of these laptops. The first I got last year for around 35 US dollars, but it had a faulty screen where the backlight doesn't work most of the time, didn't come with a battery, and was missing most of its rubber feet. But it came with a backlit keyboard option and a 500GB hard drive and a cover for it, so I ended up using that as a parts machine. Both laptops have the same CPU, graphics, and memory. The laptop I used before this was a Hitachi Flora 270W I got from a local Japanese surplus store, which I used for a good 2 years until it had its screen smashed by accident. It wasn't a pretty good laptop in the end because the Core Dual processor and ATI Radeon Express graphics on it was starting to get pretty slow for me, especially with Blender, as well as the inability to upgrade it to at least 2 gigs of RAM, as one of the memory slots in it were damaged, plus it was a pretty big and heavy laptop that I cannot find a new bag that can fit it. And on top of it all, no working battery, so it was a cumbersome and not very usable laptop. This laptop originally came with a standard keyboard, original Dell battery, a webcam, and no hard drive with a missing caddy of course. I don't get why people can't be bothered to put the caddy back in when taking out the hard drive from their laptop. Lazy Americans. It came in a pretty decent condition with not much wear on the keyboard and wrist rest, though it had some scuff marks that came from the screen bezel, likely due to having something placed on top of the laptop while it was closed. Overall, the laptop was in pretty decent condition when I got it. I personally like the design of this laptop, so simple and angular, which screams professional looking to me, unlike the normal consumer laptops you see in computer stores that are all flashy and curvy, and some even try to imitate the style of the latest MacBook. I wish there were more laptops with this kind of simple design, but well, the general consumer tends to prefer form over function, unfortunately. The laptop comes with a VGA port, two USB 2.0 ports, one of which doubles as an eSATA port, and a smart card reader just above the hard drive bay on the left of the unit. On the back, you have a charging port, display port 1.2, the battery, gigabit Ethernet, and a modem port which is blocked off, as I don't have the modem option on this as I don't need it. And on the right, you have two more USB 2.0 ports, a Wi-Fi switch, audio and microphone jacks, one of which doubles as a line-in, the Modular Bay, which I'll talk about more in a bit, an express card slot, and a 3094 port. On the front, you just have an SD card slot and a button which unlocks the screen latch. The neat thing about Dell laptops, or at least ones from the professional range, is that certain models feature a modular bay, which is a slot where you can put either a DVD drive or a secondary hard drive in a caddy. It is also hot pluggable, so you can switch drives on the fly without having to reboot your computer. A pretty sweet feature if you ask me, and I wish there were more laptops that had this level of upgradability. On the bottom, you'll just find a docking connector for a docking station or a secondary battery slice option, as well as latches that'll release the battery, which is a rare feature on laptops these days, as most have their batteries fixed and non-removable without having to take the laptop apart. The best thing about this laptop is its serviceability, starting with how you open it up. You just need to remove that single screw on the center of the bottom cover, which can now be removed by simply sliding it down. All major components are pretty much accessible from here, and you can even replace the CPU with a better one if you want, as it is socketed and not soldered. I honestly found this laptop to be the easiest to service, including when removing the display panel, a stark contrast of today's consumer laptops, which are usually difficult or impossible to do a repair or upgrade on, as they have soldered on processors and sometimes memory modules or even the SSD. As with pretty much any used laptop, I highly recommend that you replace the factory thermal compound on the processors, as the original compound has most likely dried up and lost most of its thermal conductivity. And you'll most likely get a lot of throttling if you don't apply fresh compound. However, be wary about the GPU because it is cooled under the same heat pipe as the CPU, and the GPU die does not fully touch the pipe, so if you remove the compound pad on that and replace it with a regular compound, it will not conduct heat properly, so I recommend reusing the original compound in the GPU by kneading it with fresh thermal compound and use that instead. There are better ways to solve this, such as using a very thin copper shim, but my current method works pretty okay for now. Also, careful not to apply too much pressure on the chip or you might break the die, which will pretty much kill the laptop. As for the specs of my particular E6410, It is an Intel Core i5-540M clocked at 2.4 GHz with 2 cores, 4 threads, and a turbo boost of up to 2.9 GHz, 4 GB of DDR3 1066 memory, and NVIDIA NVS 3100M graphics with 512 MB of DDR2 memory with roughly the same performance as the infamous GeForce 210. For storage, I've installed a 128GB Samsung 830 SSD, which greatly helps making this 7-year-old laptop a heck of a lot more usable thanks to its speed. The laptop only supports SATA 2 speeds, so it won't be able to utilize the full potential of the drive, but it's still pretty fast on it. I also have a 500GB Hitachi hard disk as a secondary for additional storage and for my Debian Linux installation. For the keyboard, I used to have the standard keyboard option that came with this laptop as I like the tactility of that keyboard better, but I had to give it to my brother for his E6410, which got its keyboard smashed, so I had to swap to the backlight keyboard option. Unfortunately, the backlit capability no longer works on this laptop for some reason. It was working when I installed it, but it stopped working completely after I booted to Debian Linux. I don't know if Linux broke it or it's just a general hardware failure that occurred. The keyboard still lights up on the parts laptop, but I cannot use that as it has a faulty SATA interface for the Modular Bay. Oh well. Most laptops in the Dell Latitude range, including this one, come with this pointy stick they call an AcuPoint, but I prefer to call it a track point as I used to use an IBM ThinkPad during my high school years. Personally, I much prefer this over trackpads because I find them to be a lot more precise and easier to use. Playing FPS games with it is much more playable than trackpads as it behaves like a joystick, pretty much like the little C-stick you find on the new 3DS, but only on Linux because for some reason the Windows drivers apply some sort of palm detection thing on it where it is disabled temporarily for a second or two when pressing keys for some dumb reason. And there's no way to disable it on Windows, unfortunately. For battery, I'm using a no-name brand clone battery rated at 56 amp hours, which is capable of keeping the laptop running for roughly 2 hours and up to an hour or less when running something intensive such as a 3D game. But keep in mind that the battery already has around 29% of wear, so it may last a bit longer with a fresher battery. I used to use the official Dell battery that came with this laptop, but I eventually stopped using it as it was getting really worn out and could only keep the laptop running for less than 30 minutes, which is unacceptable. I also have a spare clone battery still in its package, but I'm considering getting a larger battery option that would extend the backside of the laptop in the future. The screen is an anti-glare 16:10 aspect ratio, 14.1 inch LCD display with a native resolution of 1440x900, which is the highest resolution display available for this laptop. Be wary though because there are some E6410s, particularly the lower end i3 ones that may come with a 1280x800 display instead. As for the image quality, it's pretty okay, though the color reproduction isn't exactly great compared to more modern displays, especially the IPS ones, but it's still serviceable. Definitely better than that yellowed screen on that Flora that made coloring artwork on it pretty annoying. Also, there are a few scuff marks on my screen, though they appear to be on the back side of the display, which I cannot fix whatsoever. But well, they're very tiny and I don't notice it very much for the most part anyway. As for some unusual features, there's this Dell Latitude On button right next to the power button, which boots the laptop to the Latitude On reader, which allows you to view documents and emails without having to actually boot up the laptop. And it requires a Microsoft account, which you log into the Latitude On reader application while in Windows 7. And I imagine the kind of documents you can view with it would be very limited, so it's a pretty useless feature in most situations. The laptop also has support for an optional mobile broadband module, which you can tell by the cellular signal logo on the status lights, and a SIM card slot inside the battery compartment. I don't know much about the details on what protocols it supports though, as I cannot find much information about what modes it supports, but I believe it will only support up to 3G. Okay, let's turn this thing on, shall we? It takes a while for the BIOS splash screen to show up. The BIOS features a graphical interface which you can control with a mouse, just like most modern UEFI enabled BIOSes these days. I'm not exactly sure when Dell introduced this kind of BIOS, and the oldest Dell computer I've seen that features this BIOS was a Dell Optiplex 300 series desktop computer, but I believe it was around the time when they started introducing UEFI on their systems. It's a pretty standard BIOS as far as Dell computer BIOSes go, where you can look at your system summary, customizing the boot order, toggle hardware and processor options, as well as setting a one-time programmable asset tag. There's one major flaw with the BIOS I found on this particular laptop that I find really annoying, which I'll explain in a bit. The most annoying thing I found about this laptop's BIOS is that the boot sequence menu of this is apparently a bit buggy. As you can see, it appears I have a Western Digital hard drive on this laptop, but actually I don't have. I only have a Samsung A30 SSD and a Hitachi hard disk as a secondary. Usually this hard disk entry would say internal hard drive or something. But another buggy thing about the boot sequence menu is that when I was trying to configure the secondary hard disk of this laptop as my boot device, because I have the Grub bootloader there and I want to keep the MBR in my SSD intact, if I have just the module at first, if you just have the Modular Bay HDD checked, it will still boot the primary hard disk. And if you have both internal and Modular Bay HDD checked, and then you have the Modular Bay as the first item here, it would still boot the primary hard disk instead of the secondary. It's really annoying, and I'm using the latest BIOS available for this laptop. So they never managed to fix it throughout its life. Unfortunate. So my workaround on this was to basically fumble with these options, and then as well as removing and then plugging back in the primary hard disk to get it to boot the Modular Bay hard disk, even though the primary hard disk is present. Yeah, it's really annoying and a bit tricky for me to explain, but basically I'm not sure if it's a problem with this laptop, like how the keyboard illumination no longer works on this, but I haven't tried another E6410 if it also experiences this issue as well. So I don't know. With the BIOS aside, let's see how fast Windows 7 boots. Once I get past the Grub boot menu. Thanks to the SSD I've installed, this thing actually boots faster than all of my friends' laptops, like I said earlier in this video, and apps load almost instantly as well, which helps make this laptop a heck of a lot more usable despite being 7 years old. I installed Windows 7 Professional on this laptop using a Dell OEM version of the installer I downloaded from you know where. The odd thing I found about the installer is that it never asked for a product key during installation, yet the installer is considered fully legit, and I was able to download a bunch of updates without that dreaded Windows is not genuine message cropping up. Kinda unusual if you ask me, and no, I did not install cracks and such to the installation whatsoever. The general performance of this laptop is actually still fairly usable for common day-to-day tasks. General web browsing is nice and smooth with Google Chrome, and you can even watch 1080p 60fps videos on it flawlessly with the H.264 add-on, as the NVS3100M supports hardware H.264 decoding, which Google Chrome can utilize. There's a bit of an issue when watching those kinds of videos though, and that is when you go to another tab while watching a video on one tab, and then going back to the video will cause the video to stall for some reason. Not sure why it happens though. As for gaming, it's sufficient for playing 2D games such as Freedom Planet, though more intensive 2D games such as Cuphead tends to run at a cinematic 30 FPS half of the time. Older 3D games such as Quake 3 Arena obviously runs perfectly smoothly, getting around 250 to 300 FPS in the time and demo benchmark, but newer and more demanding 3D games such as Team Fortress 2 runs a bit on the choppy side on medium, and Payday 2 looks and runs like an N64 game with the lowest settings. For light gaming and emulation, it's great, but not so much in the heavier stuff, which is to be expected on a 7-year-old laptop. For productivity tasks, light and moderate 3D modeling with Blender feels very smooth. Rendering with cycles is obviously going to be pretty slow if you're working with a very intensive scene. Drawing with Krita is also pretty great, but it'll start to feel sloppy if you're drawing something in 4K resolution, as the laptop just doesn't have enough horsepower to handle it smoothly enough. Working on large projects using the NetBeans IDE also works pretty great after you give the IDE some time to finish parsing your project. Now for some benchmarks with Cinebench. The Core i5-520M with its 4 threads was able to score around 195 CB on the CPU benchmark, while the NVS 3100M got around 7.6 FPS in the OpenGL benchmark. Not much to write home about in the end though. As for Linux on this laptop, in case you prefer installing Linux instead of Windows if you're planning to get a laptop like this, I installed Debian Linux as a secondary operating system on this laptop, as I spend most of my programming time on Linux these days, simply because some things just work a bit snappier on Linux than on Windows. When setting up a fresh install, I recommend installing the proprietary NVIDIA 304XX legacy driver if you want to have faster OpenGL performance, hardware video decoding, and being able to utilize NVIDIA specific features such as CUDA. However, installing the legacy driver will break Hibernate and Suspend, so you'll have to disable Hibernate altogether and uninstall Light Locker, which tends to have issues with the proprietary drivers, and use Screensaver's locker feature instead. You don't have to do all of this if you prefer to stick with the open source Novio driver that comes included with Linux, as that one does not break the Hibernate or Suspend whatsoever. Everything else, such as wireless and audio, should work right out of the box. The laptop actually performs a bit more smoothly when running Linux, such as browsing the internet, especially when the trackpoint scroll wheel works a lot smoother under Linux, and the momentary video stall when switching tabs that happens under Windows no longer happens under Linux. The only major issue I had with Linux on this laptop is just the inability to hibernate the laptop, but other than that, it's pretty decent. Running Linux also fixes an issue with a built-in card reader where SD cards containing multiple partitions will be recognized as unformatted under Windows, but is detected properly under Linux. Just something to keep in mind in case you're playing around with Raspberry Pis or managing SD cards containing multiple partitions in general. In conclusion, I think this laptop still holds up pretty well in 2017 for web browsing and light to moderate productivity tasks. Obviously, this laptop isn't going to blow away any current mid to high-end laptop in the market these days. In fact, the performance of the first gen Core i5 520M processor of this is roughly the same as a low-end Intel Celeron processor you find in a $350 US dollar budget-oriented laptop, which would most likely have a longer lasting battery. But well, that's in the $350 price range, while you can get a Dell Latitude E6410 for under $100 US if you're patient enough. I also think this laptop feels a lot better to use than those budget oriented laptops because this thing feels pretty robust. In fact, the hinges of this laptop are made of metal, and the bottom chassis of the laptop is made of a magnesium alloy. Unlike the budget-oriented laptops that are all made of plastic and often feel like a toy to use. In fact, this laptop actually experienced a table high drop one time, and it only experienced minor damage, which I was able to fix very easily. I imagine a budget-oriented laptop that's made entirely out of plastic would have at least a sizable chunk of its plastic break off when it experiences such a fall. The ability to upgrade the CPU, memory, and the option to add a secondary hard drive on this laptop, I think gives this a bit of an edge over those budget-oriented laptops that have little to no degree of expandability. And also the docking connector on the bottom would come in handy to those who want to use their laptop like a desktop when they're at home. So where you basically just buy a docking station, and then when you're going to use your laptop on your desk, you just snap it onto the docking station and it's already like a desktop. Then when it's time to go someplace else where you need to bring your laptop, you just simply yank it out of the docking station, and there you go. It's pretty much like a Nintendo Switch essentially, but it's a laptop computer.
However, you're still limited to first gen Core i series processors when it comes to upgrading this laptop, and the E6410 only supports certain Core i3, i5, and i7 processors, unless you have the bigger brother of this laptop, the E6510, which supports more powerful processors. So your already limited upgrade path is further limited by the limitations of this laptop. But well, if you can live with a Core i5 520M with 4 gigs of RAM, which isn't actually too bad to be honest based on my experience with this laptop, unless you're planning to do some very intensive tasks, that is, I'd say this laptop is still pretty good to be honest, if you can find one for a reasonable price. However, the downside with getting a used laptop like this is that the ones that are of a reasonable price often usually don't have a hard disk included along with its caddy, so no OS, as well as maybe a missing battery and no charger included as well. So you're most likely going to have to spend a little extra to buy the parts necessary, as well as the computer know-how to install those parts and install the OS such as Windows 7, which makes this laptop a bit tough to recommend to those who are not very tech savvy, pretty much. But if you're a tech savvy individual like I am and don't mind spending a little extra and know exactly what to do when refurbishing a used laptop to a fully usable state, I'd say I'd recommend getting this laptop if you can find one for a very reasonable price. When picking a hard drive for the laptop though, I highly recommend going for an SSD because it would help greatly with loading performance on the laptop, because the biggest bottleneck with old laptops and even the newer ones is the hard disk, because manufacturers usually stick a very slow 5400 RPM hard drive, which is incredibly slow. I think they usually go up to like 60 MB per second read speed maximum, and that's with a sequential read. If you can afford a little extra for an SSD, I recommend going with an SSD if you can afford one, that is. Lately, I'm still working on Project Scarlet, mainly the map composer tool, which is by far the biggest and most complicated part of the development of Project Scarlet, because it's essentially a map composing tool, and implementing all the tools and features I need into the program are just massive, simply put it. Hopefully I should be able to get a short demo montage of the engine's progress by January of next year if things go according to plan. I'm also working on trying to restore a 21-inch Mitsubishi Diamondtron monitor, which I used to use as my main monitor 2 years ago, until it started to become unreliable and I was essentially forced to upgrade to an LCD monitor. And the reason why I'm restoring the monitor in the first place is I wanted to use it to make a sequel of that gaming at 120 Hz on a CRT video, which so far is the most viewed video that I've released in a short amount of time, surprisingly enough. And the 21-inch Mitsubishi, if I remember correctly, supports up to 200 Hz at 640 by 40. Maybe even 240 if I'm lucky, but I'm not exactly sure because my memory on experimenting with the high refresh rates on that monitor is a bit fuzzy. So the only way to know if I'm correct with that or not is when I get the monitor fully operational and I do a video of it. If I'm lucky with successfully restoring the monitor, that is. If I can't get the monitor working properly whatsoever anymore, no doubt that means there will be no sequel to that video, unfortunately. But I'll do my best. I'm gonna try to restore that monitor in a decent enough condition so I can make a video of it later down the line. Well, I guess this is pretty much it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you want, please leave a like, comment, or share this video if you want, and maybe even subscribe if you want to see more from me. And as always, thanks for watching. LameGuy64 is signing out, and Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year.